Hello, and welcome to CMES Conversations, a series of interviews with leading scholars and thinkers hosted by the University of Denver's Center for Middle East Studies. On this week's episode, Director Nader Hashemi speaks with Osama Makdisi, Professor of History and Chair of Arab Studies at Rice University. Professor Rashid Khalidi of Columbia University has called Makdisi one of the premier historians of the modern Arab world and of the Arab-American encounter. Professor Makdisi is the author of 3 books: The Culture of Sectarianism, Community, History, and Violence in the 19th Century Ottoman Lebanon, Artillery of Heaven, American Missionaries and the Failed Conversion of the Middle East, which the Middle East Journal has called a model for a new kind of transnational history that sheds light on American engagement with the world, and Faith Misplaced, the Broken Promise of U.S.-Arab Relations, 1820 to 2001, which Publishers Weekly said efficiently debunks the Huntingtonian belief in an inevitable clash of civilizations and resurrects a forgotten history of mutual curiosity and cultural cross-pollination between the East and the West. On April 30th, the Center for Middle East Studies hosted a lecture by Professor Makdisi titled Understanding Sectarianism: The History and Future of the Middle East Gordian Knot. Thank you once again for joining us on this episode of CMES Conversations.
Osama Makdisi, it's a huge honor to have you here at the University of Denver. As you know, the question of sectarianism is, in the news in a big way. And your book, The Culture of Sectarianism, has sort of been rediscovered as an important sort of historical inquiry into the origins of the question of sectarianism in the modern Middle East. So my first question is really a question that comes right out of your book. And in broad terms, you write that sectarianism really is a modern story, contrary to popular belief that it's rooted in age-old habits and behaviors. You say that sectarianism is a modern story and that it's all about location in the modern world, where the margins can become centers. Could you sort of elaborate on, the broad theme of the sort of modern origins of sectarianism?
Yes, what I tried to say in the book, which of course, as you know, I wrote 18 years ago at this point, published 15 years ago, sorry.
Right.
In the book, the argument was, in essence, that to say that there have been sectarian moments or acts of violence in the medieval past, in the ancient past, in the pre-modern past, in the early modern past, and in the present doesn't really say very much at all. So what I was really interested in, and what I said in that quotation, what I was trying to say in that book was basically that to understand the sectarianism, we have to think of it both as a discourse, as a way of describing acts of violence, and at the same time to actually understand the acts of violence in a particular historical context. And the point was that in the 19th century Ottoman Empire, just as what's going on today in the Middle East and the Arab world, it is absolutely essential to focus on the historical context. In other words, the moment, the political, the cultural, the economic, all these factors that come together to define what is actually happening, as opposed to falling back into myths of age-old violence that doesn't actually explain at all why in the 19th century, in a particular point in time, there are these sectarian moments, acts, and violence, and why at other points there aren't. And that's why I think it's really crucially important to focus on particular contexts.
Right. So give us a sense of sort of the historical context of sort of 19th century Ottoman Empire and the case study that you looked at. What was happening sort of politically, economically, culturally that sort of explains this phenomenon of sectarianism as in many ways is a model that you sort of lay out for understanding the broader theme of sectarianism in the Middle East?
Well, I think the first point, of course, the first point to remind ourselves of is that the term sectarianism itself was not used in the 19th century. It's very much a 20th century, especially in Arabic, and the word ta'ifiyya is very much a modern contemporary Arabic word to describe these moments of religious, what are perceived to be moments of religious, irrational, fundamentalist extremism. But of course, the reality is in the mid-19th century, the great context was the transformation of the Ottoman Empire under enormous European pressure, enormous military pressure, political pressure, economic pressure, to reform itself, to reform its economy, to reform its political structure, to move away from being an Islamic empire which privileged Muslims and Islam into being quote, a non-discriminatory empire, as paradoxical as that was. And that transformation, that shift from discrimination towards a language of non-discrimination and a politics of non-discrimination created a fundamental change and instability. And it's in that moment that you see acts and moments of what we refer to as sectarianism, as sectarian violence. But of course, that's not any different from, I think, other parts of the world, which also saw massive shifts, whether it's in the United States, whether it's Europe, whether it's other parts of the world.
Right. Yeah, and you also sort of talk about the discourse on sectarianism as being sort of the antithesis to emerging nationalist discourses, where the two were sort of juxtaposed against one another, and that sort of nationalism sort of posits sectarianism as this sort of, opposite ideological sort of framing of the world that new nationalisms are trying to construct themselves against.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, nationalist discourse and nationalist writers are the ones who think of sectarianism as the antithesis, because sectarianism is the division of the nation.
Right.
And nationalists, of course, presume that they want to unify the nation. Now, of course, what they take for granted, of course, is the nation itself and the idea of the nation. And so to understand sectarianism, to understand the discourse about sectarianism, it's really important for us to be focused on how nationalists, in the case of the Arab world, not just the Arab world, but nationalists in many parts of the world, and of course empires, whether it's the Ottoman Empire, whether it's the British or French Empire, before the nationalists, in fact, also talked about these moments as barbarism. So they talked about it as barbarism, nationalists talk about it as sectarianism. In both instances, they're describing something that they consider to be pre-modern, that they consider to be some kind of vestige of a past that has to be eradicated by a civilized state, whether it's an empire or a nation state.
Right. So how would you respond to someone who would say, but look, if we look at some of these different religious groupings in the Middle East, there are moments in the past where they were in conflict with one another, where it led to bloodshed. How are those moments any different than sort of contemporary moments, whether it's the 19th century Mount Lebanon or even today?
Well, I mean, the obvious answer is to say contextualize. What do you mean? It's like saying there are moments of racial violence in the past and there are moments of racial violence in the present. That doesn't make all moments of racial violence the same.
Right. So how do we explain them? What's the motives and causes?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, the way you explain them is through analysis of economics, of culture, of politics, of geopolitics, of all these things coming together to explain a particular manifestation of violence, which you can code as sectarian, you can code as irrational, you can code as religious, you can code as anything you want. But in the end, you have to explain why is it at a particular point in time that you have these eruptions. The argument, the people who say, oh, it's age old, are simply sort of not actually investigating in any kind of rigor or in any kind of integrity or honesty why at specific moments and not at others. I mean, so you've had sectarian eruptions in the Middle East at points in the 19th century, at points in the 20th century, and at points in the 21st century, but you've also had a tremendous history where you didn't have these things. So the idea is, again, to always focus on particular historical context.
And so when people think of sectarianism, they generally think of sort of the role of religion sort of playing a certain salient and important role in explaining outcomes. How do you sort of tease out the differences between the role that religion plays in these moments of conflict and the role of politics and sort of history? How can we disentangle them, and how do they sort of relate to one another?
Well, I mean, the fact of diversity, there is a fact of diversity and religious diversity, or you can call sectarian diversity in the Middle East. That is a social reality. It's been that way for centuries and centuries. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have sectarian violence. Right. And so the idea of people confusing diversity for sectarianism itself is one of the great problems. Right. And I think it's one of the great impediments to historical understanding, or even understanding of contemporary politics. Right. So certainly religion and religious affiliations play a role without any question in what is happening today, what happened in the 19th century, but they didn't play the only role or even the primary role. And politics certainly plays a huge role, so does economics, so does European intervention, US intervention. These have all played massive roles in transforming the context within which various sectarian conflicts erupt and then get resolved.
And looking sort of down the road, do you have any thoughts on how the Middle East today broadly can move forward toward a path of desectarianization? What sort of are the broad I guess, political, social conditions, in other words, that one would sort of have to encourage and foster if we wanted to move away from this very dark moment now where, unfortunately, sectarianism, or at least the perception of it, is at a heightened level.
Well,
So what needs to happen to move towards somewhere better? How do you desectarianize, in other words, the Middle East? What has to happen broadly
Well, I
speaking?
think the first thing is basic understanding. Honestly, I mean, you're asking a political question.
Right.
But at the most profound level, it seems to me, the obvious thing is for us to remember and to bear in mind that the Middle East itself has been a place, or what you're calling the Middle East, has been a place of tremendous diversity for centuries. Now, the idea is not to romanticize that diversity or to pretend that coexistence has been all equality and wonders. It wasn't. But nevertheless, there was coexistence in the literal meaning of the term coexistence, living side by side. Accepting the idea of diversity. And that history is extremely important to bear in mind, to resurrect, to excavate, in a sense, and to remind ourselves of, because that history is, I think, the greatest indication that the moment we're living in now is not something that's been inevitable. It's not something that is, foreordained. It is a particular moment that we happen to be living in, and it will change.
Right.
Now, how it will change, I can't, that's not for me to say.
And I'm pushing you a bit, and you're a historian, not a political scientist.
Well, even any political scientist says they're going to tell you how it's going to change.
Right. And they're most likely going to get it wrong.
Yeah, are going to get it wrong. But no, seriously, but the point is to say that there is a tremendous history and heritage that we should be aware of.
Right.
And it seems to me the tragedy is when we either simplify that heritage and romanticize it, or we deny it.
Right.
And it's much more, of course, insidious when we deny it and we pretend that these people have been killing each other for centuries. That's simply not the case.
Right. And those are good thoughts. I mean, in terms of understanding the past to sort of inform the present.
Yeah.
One final question here on someone who's sort of written a book on the question of really sectarian violence, mostly Sunni and Shia, that got a lot of play about 10 years ago. Vali Nas published this book called The Shia Revival, How Conflicts Within Islam Will Shape the Future. And he suggested that the traditional concepts for understanding the Middle East, such as modernity, democracy, fundamentalism, nationalism. He said no longer explain the politics of the region today. And then he said it's rather the old feuds between Sunni and Shia that forge attitudes, define prejudices, and draws political boundaries, and even decides whether and to what extent those other trends have any relevance.
Yeah, I just think that's utterly simplistic and misleading, honestly. I think the idea of saying that you can understand everything that's going on in the Middle East today simply by recourse to a discourse of Sunni-Shia rivalry, an age-old animosity, doesn't at all explain why it is that since 2003 and 2006 you've had this massive upsurge, uptick in sectarian mobilizations and violence in the region. So I think you could certainly say that maybe scholars in the past weren't attentive enough to sectarian tensions, sectarian rivalries, but there's no question that Western imperialism has played a massive role. Western intervention has played a massive role in shaping the Middle East, in making and unmaking the Middle East, the Arab world in particular, the Arab-Israeli conflict, the creation of Israel, the expulsion of the Palestinians. All these have played a huge role. The Arab states themselves. These are all massively important.
One of my students would say, if I were to raise the question of the Israel-Palestine conflict and its negative legacy on destabilizing the Middle East as a way of trying to explain sort of what's going on today, they would say, what's the connection between the two? Sunnis and Shias on one hand are killing each other and you're blaming Israelis and Palestinians or that conflict? I don't see the connection. And so the question would be, what is the connection?
Well, these all belong to the same modern moment. And the connection would be, the connection is not, and by connection it's not saying
cause and effect.
Yeah, the idea is not saying what you see today in Yemen, for instance, is the fault of Israel.
Right.
I mean, I don't know anyone who's suggesting that that is the case. But what we're talking about is saying that beginning in the 20th century, in the mid-20th century, you've had this extraordinary politicization of various religious identities. And of course, when Israel was created, you had the largest, as far as I can tell, if I'm not mistaken, you had a massive ethnic cleansing of not just of Palestinian Muslims, but also Palestinian Christians. Right. You then had, of course, the Jewish communities in the Arab world that came under enormous pressure as part and parcel of the same emergent conflict. Right. So a tragedy that has two facets to it. Right. And that set a certain sort of, that put enormous pressure in the Levant, and then you've had other factors, not just that you've had the Arab states, you've had the dictatorships that have developed in the Arab world, you've had, of course, the US invasion of Iraq, you have Saudi Wahhabism, you have the Iranian Revolution. All these things together in the modern period have put enormous pressure on a reality of coexistence and a history of coexistence in this region. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, no, that's a very good answer. So last question, if you were to sort of give advice to someone watching this interview, a student, just a member of the reading public who wants to understand this question of sectarianism at a deeper level, besides reading your book, what advice would you give them? Where would they go to sort of, what should they be reading, in other words? Where would be a good place for someone who's seriously interested in getting a deeper sort of understanding of the historic context, since you're a historian?
Well,
where would you turn?
Contextualize, historicize. Just read as widely as possible.
Right.
I mean, the idea of saying there's one book to read, I think would be
simplistic.
Yeah, I can't say that there's one book to one read, but just think of it in terms of, I think the most important thing is do not judge as somehow that this is an aberrant part of the world, or this is a part of the world that is mired in its sort of age-old troubles. I think that is what is fundamentally misleading. Rather than judge, try to be empathetic, try to understand that coexistence and diversity are never easy questions or problems anywhere in the world. They're not in America. Look what's happening today in Baltimore. Look what's happened in Ferguson, Missouri. Look at the history of the United States with race relations, slavery, Jim Crow, all these things that have happened in the United States. Look at Europe with anti-Semitism. Look at India with communalism. I mean, so the idea of saying that the Arab world has particular problems that are tied to the question of how do we structure a political culture in which diversity is recognized and maintained is a real challenge and a question, but it's not unique to the Arab world.
It's a global problem.
Of course it is.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, I wish we could speak more, but you have a lecture that you have to deliver in a few moments.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Yes, thanks very much.